This isn't some backwoods swamp, Mr. Callahan. It's an upscale planned community, and your weed patch is a direct and flagrant violation of our aesthetic covenants, specifically Article 4, Section B, subsection 3. The fines now total $5,750. And if we don't see a landscaping crew and a lawnmower out here by Monday, we will place a lien on your property and proceed with forced remediation at your expense. The woman speaking to me, Karen Miller, the self-appointed queen of the Oak Creek Meadows Homeowners Association, delivered the words with the smug finality of a judge passing sentence. She stood on the pristine asphalt of my driveway, a stark, plus-size figure clad in a violently pink tracksuit, clutching a clipboard to her chest like a holy shield. Her gaze swept over my 3-acre property, not with appreciation for the riot of late summer wildflowers and tall native grasses swaying in the breeze, but with a look of profound disgust, as if she'd just found a rat in her kitchen. The weed patch she was referring to was, in fact, one of the last remaining parcels of untouched black soil, prairie and sedge meadow in the entire county. A delicate and complex ecosystem I had spent the last 2 years painstakingly restoring. The rustling blue-stem grass, the purple heads of the blazing star flowers, the chorus of frogs hidden in the damp corners. To her, it was just an unkempt, chaotic mess that offended her rigid, suburban sensibilities. She tapped a perfectly manicured nail on the top sheet of her clipboard, a spreadsheet of violations and escalating fines that looked more like a rap sheet. $5,000 for letting nature exist. I just looked at her, my face calm, a discipline forged over 20 years in the Army Corps of Engineers, building bridges under fire and de-arming explosives in places she couldn't find on a map. Her bureaucratic threats felt like gnats buzzing around my head, but gnats left unchecked can become a swarm. This was no longer a simple disagreement, it was a declaration of war. If you're watching this and you've ever felt the cold, suffocating grip of an out-of-control HOA, or if you believe a person's property is their own damn business, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. I want you to drop a comment below and tell me where you're from and what your own HOA nightmare story is, because I promise you, what happened next is something you won't want to miss. You see, Karen had just made the biggest mistake of her life. She thought she was fining a stubborn homeowner for a messy yard. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly comprehend, was that she was threatening to destroy a state-protected habitat, and the quiet veteran she was trying to steamroll was the newly appointed regional director for the State Department of Fish and Wildlife. She had just handed me all the ammunition I would ever need to not only save my property, but to dismantle her petty little empire, piece by glorious piece. It had all started with a dream of silence. After 2 decades of the constant, grinding noise of military life, the roar of diesel engines, the whine of turbines, the concussive whump of distant explosions, all I wanted was a piece of land where the only sounds were the wind and the birds. When I retired from the Corps, I took a position with the state's Conservation Department, a desk job that felt more like a calling. It was a way to keep building, not with steel and concrete, but with soil and seed. My search for a home led me to a peculiar listing on the edge of the sprawling Oak Creek Meadows development. It was a 3-acre lot, the last undeveloped parcel, an odd-shaped wedge of land backing up to a thicket of woods the developer had been unable to clear due to drainage issues. The realtor had been almost apologetic, calling it a bit wild and in need of significant landscaping. The moment I stepped out of my truck and onto the property, I knew. I could feel it in the soles of my boots. The ground was soft and peaty, and the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something ancient and green. While the surrounding landscape had been scraped flat and covered in cookie-cutter houses with identical squares of chemically treated turf, this small patch had survived. It was a remnant, a ghost of the vast prairies that once covered this entire region. I saw past the tangled growth the realtor grimaced at. I saw the deep-rooted switchgrass, the hardy compass plants, and the delicate, almost invisible shoots of prairie drop seed. It wasn't a mess. It was a living museum. I bought it that same day, paying cash with the bulk of my military retirement savings. I was given the thick binder of HOA covenants and restrictions, a document so dense with legalese and arbitrary rules that it could have been used as a doorstop for a bank vault. I skimmed it, noting the usual nonsense about mailbox colors and fence heights, but nothing seemed to specifically forbid what I had in mind. Not landscaping, but unlandscaping. My plan was simple. I would build a small, unobtrusive house on the far edge of the property, nestled against the tree line, and dedicate the other 2.5 acres to a full-scale ecological restoration. I wanted to bring it back to what it was 200 years ago. I spent the first year just observing, walking the land every day, documenting the existing native species, and methodically removing the invasive ones. The thistle, the buckthorn, the insidious, creeping Charlie that had bled in from the neighboring lawns. It was slow, quiet work, done with my own hands. I felt more at peace pulling weeds and scattering native seeds than I had in years. The neighbors were mostly indifferent. My property was at the end of a cul-de-sac. In the back of my land was my own private wilderness. They saw my small, gray house go up and probably just figured I was a slow-moving eccentric. That all changed the day Karen Miller was elected HOA president. She won on a platform of restoring community standards and protecting property values, which was code for waging a holy war on individuality. She drove her golf cart around the neighborhood like a patrol car, her clipboard, her weapon, her eyes scanning for any infraction, no matter how small. My property, with its wild, untamed appearance, was like a personal affront to her entire worldview. The first notice was a polite, form letter suggestion to address the overgrowth of weeds in my yard. I responded with a polite, detailed letter of my own, explaining that my property was not overgrown with weeds, but was in fact a native prairie restoration project. I included a list of the plant species, their ecological benefits, and a short paragraph on the importance of preserving local biodiversity. I thought that would be the end of it. I had, after all, provided a logical and factual explanation. I had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of my enemy. Karen wasn't interested in logic or facts. She was interested in compliance. My explanation was, in her mind, an act of defiance. A week later, the second letter arrived. It was no longer a suggestion. It was a formal warning, citing specific HOA bylaws about lawn height and unkempt appearance. $100 fine was attached. I wrote another letter, this time including photographs of the blooming butterfly weed attracting a swarm of monarchs, and a printout from the State University's Extension Office on the benefits of native landscaping. I even invited her to walk the property with me so I could explain the project in person. Her response was to double the fine and add another violation for failure to respond to a board directive. It became a grim, bureaucratic rhythm. Every 2 weeks, a new letter, a new fine, the total climbing into the thousands. I continued my own documentation, saving every threatening letter, every email, and a copy of every educational, placating response I sent. I was building a case brick by brick, creating a paper trail that would show a clear pattern of targeted harassment. My quiet sanctuary was now a battleground, and Karen Miller, in her quest for absolute control over grass height and aesthetic conformity, had just awakened a man who had spent his entire adult life planning, strategizing, and winning asymmetrical conflicts. She saw a messy yard. I saw the terrain of my next mission. The fines were becoming absurd, spiraling into a figure that was more than my yearly property taxes. Karen's letters grew more aggressive, the language shifting from bureaucratic jargon to outright personal attacks. She called my restoration project a public nuisance, a fire hazard, and an eyesore that is single-handedly depressing the property values of this entire community. She was a master of hyperbolic, fear-mongering language, and she was broadcasting it in the official HOA newsletter, carefully omitting my name, but describing my property in such specific detail that there was no doubt who the target was. I knew I couldn't fight this alone, not if I wanted to change the system rather than just win a single battle. My first stop was my next-door neighbor, a retired Air Force colonel named George Peterson. George was a stern, quiet man in his late 70s who spent most of his days meticulously polishing his vintage Cadillac or pruning his rose bushes with military precision. His lawn was a perfect green carpet, the polar opposite of my wild acre. I expected a lecture. Instead, I found a surprising ally. I caught him as he was heading to his mailbox, and Taking a deep breath, I laid it all out for him. The project, the letters, the escalating fines. I showed him the latest demand letter, the one threatening a lien. He read it, his brow furrowed, his jaw tight. He then looked over my fence, not at my house, but at the expanse of prairie beyond. His gaze wasn't disgusted, it was analytical. Blue stem, he said, pointing with his chin. My grandfather's farm in Nebraska was covered in it. Haven't seen a patch that healthy in 50 years. He handed the letter back to me. That woman, he said, his voice a low rumble, is a petty tyrant drunk on the thimbleful of power this ridiculous organization gave her. She tried to fine me $200 last month because my garden hose wasn't coiled in a visually pleasing concentric circle. I sent her back a picture of a coiled snake and a copy of the Declaration of Independence. A slow smile spread across my face. This was a man who understood the enemy. She's trying to force me to destroy it, George, I said, gesturing to the prairie. She wants me to plow it under and plant fescue. George was silent for a long moment, his eyes scanning the horizon. In my last command, he finally said, we had a saying, never mistake enthusiasm for capability. Karen is enthusiastic, but she's leading with her chin, and she has no idea who she's picking a fight with. She sees a quiet man and assumes he's a weak one. He looked me straight in the eye. I was a JAG officer for 10 years before I went into command. Let me see all your paperwork. Every letter, every email. We're going to build a fortress of facts around you so high that she can't climb over it. That evening, I carried a heavy accordion file over to George's house. We sat at his large oak dining table, the smell of lemon polish and old books in the air. For 3 hours, we spread the documents out, arranging them chronologically. George read every word, his face grim. He pointed out Karen's procedural errors, her emotional and unprofessional language, her clear-cut case of selective enforcement. She's giving us everything we need, he muttered, tapping a particularly nasty letter. This isn't about the grass, son. This is about submission. My next visit was to Sarah Jenkins, a young mother of 2 who lived across the street. I'd seen Karen berating her a few weeks prior, standing over the woman with her clipboard, while Sarah's 2 small children looked on, terrified. I found Sarah in her front yard, nervously scrubbing at a faint chalk drawing on her driveway. She looked up as I approached, her eyes wide with anxiety. I'm so sorry, Mr. Callahan, she said immediately. The kids were just drawing, and I know the rules say the driveway has to be clear. Sarah, I interrupted gently, it's okay. I'm not here about that. I'm here because of that. I nodded toward Karen's house down the street. I explained my situation, and as I spoke, I saw a flicker of recognition in her eyes, then anger. She told me how Karen had fined her $500 because her son's portable basketball hoop had been left at the edge of their driveway overnight. She had issued a violation because the color of the flowers in her window boxes weren't on the pre-approved seasonal palette. Sarah was a single mom, working 2 jobs, and the constant threat of these arbitrary fines was causing her immense financial and emotional stress. I'm afraid of her, she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. She threatened to call social services on me once, said my kids' toys in the yard constituted a neglectful environment. Who does that? George, the retired lawyer colonel, and Sarah, the terrified but resilient single mom. We were an unlikely trio, but we were the beginning of a resistance. We agreed to start talking to other neighbors, quietly, discreetly. We started a private email chain, a digital command center where we could share information and stories. What we uncovered was a widespread pattern of abuse. Fines for holiday decorations left up a day too late. Violations for trash cans being visible from the street for more than the allotted 2 hours on trash day. A retired school teacher was being hounded for the unapproved shade of her front door paint. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules. She was terrorizing people for sport. She preyed on the elderly, the single parents, the quiet ones she thought wouldn't fight back. But with every new story, our resolve hardened. This was bigger than my prairie. It was about reclaiming our homes and our peace of mind from a bully who had wrapped her personal vendettas in the guise of community governance. The battle lines were drawn, and our small alliance was ready to dig in for a siege. The time for passive resistance was over. It was time to escalate, but with precision and overwhelming force. My position as regional director for the Department of Fish and Wildlife gave me access to resources and expertise that Karen couldn't possibly anticipate. I was going to turn my professional life into a weapon for my personal one, but I was going to do it by the book, ensuring every step was legally unimpeachable. I took a week of personal leave from my job. On Monday morning, instead of driving to my office, I drove a state-marked pickup truck, one I had signed out for official off-hours personal use as per department policy for habitat assessment on private lands, to my own driveway. I was joined by Dr. Eris Thorne, the state's leading herpetologist, and Lena Petrova, our department's top botanist. They were colleagues, but more importantly, they were friends who had listened to my HOA saga with a mixture of professional outrage and personal amusement. They had volunteered their weekend to help me conduct a formal biological survey of my property. "So this is the infamous weed patch," Eris said with a grin, stepping out of his car. He was a wiry man with a perpetual tan and an infectious enthusiasm for anything that crawled or hopped. "It's magnificent, Mark. Absolutely magnificent." Lena was already on her hands and knees, peering at the ground with a hand lens. "My God, Mark, is this what I think it is?" she breathed, pointing to a small, unassuming plant with delicate white flowers. "This is Platanthera leucophea, the eastern prairie fringed orchid. We thought it was extirpated from this county. There are fewer than a dozen known populations in the entire state." My heart hammered in my chest. I knew I had some rare plants, but a federally threatened species of orchid? This changed everything. For the next 2 days, we worked methodically, gridding off the entire 2.5 acres. We set up drift fences and pitfall traps for amphibians and reptiles. We conducted transect surveys for plant species and set up mist nets for avian cataloging. It was a full-blown scientific expedition happening right in the middle of a suburban development. Neighbors would slow their cars as they drove by, staring at the strange sight of people in khaki vests wading through the tall grass with nets and clipboards. Karen, I was told, drove by no fewer than 5 times on the first day, her face a mask of pure, confused fury. She probably thought I'd hired an incredibly nerdy and over-equipped landscaping crew. The results of our survey were staggering, far beyond my wildest expectations. Lena identified over 150 species of native plants, including not just the federally threatened orchid, but 3 other species listed as of special concern by the state. The property was a genetic reservoir, a tiny, invaluable lifeboat of biodiversity. But Eris delivered the knockout blow on the second afternoon. He came jogging back from the dampest corner of the property, his eyes wide with excitement. In a small, clear container, he held a tiny, mottled green and brown frog, no bigger than my thumbnail. "You are not going to believe this," he said, barely able to contain himself. "It's a male Pseudacris ornata, the ornate chorus frog." I stared at the little creature. I knew the name. The ornate chorus frog was listed as state endangered. It was notoriously difficult to find, living in ephemeral wetlands and spending most of its life buried in the soil. Its presence was an ironclad indicator of a pristine, functioning wetland ecosystem. Finding one was the ecological equivalent of finding a gold nugget. We documented everything: high-resolution photographs, GPS coordinates, population counts, habitat analysis. We took soil samples and water samples. By the time we were done, we had a 60-page report complete with signed affidavits from Dr. Thorne and Ms. Petrova, 2 of the most respected names in their fields. The report didn't just suggest my property was an important habitat. It proved, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that it was a critical, irreplaceable sanctuary for multiple state and federally protected species. My weed patch wasn't just a personal project anymore. It was, by legal definition, a protected natural resource. The $5,000 fine for my unkempt lawn was now a demand from the HOA for me to commit a state and federal crime by destroying the habitat of endangered and threatened species. The potential penalties for that, fines upwards of $50,000 and possible jail time, made Karen's little lean threat look like a parking ticket. I spent the next evening at George's dining table again. We took the new biological survey and placed it on top of the pile of HOA violation letters. The contrast was almost comical. On one side, a stack of petty, vindictive demands based on aesthetic preference. On the other, a scientifically rigorous, legally binding document establishing the land's immense ecological value. "Checkmate," George said, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face. "She wanted a war of paperwork, Mark. You're about to drop a nuclear bomb on her." He was right. This was no longer a defensive action. We were preparing a counteroffensive, and Karen Miller had no idea what was about to hit her. The time had come to deploy the weapon we had so carefully assembled. Our strategy, devised over George's polished oak table, was one of overwhelming legal force, delivered not with a shout, but with the cold, quiet authority of certified mail. I spent a full day compiling what George affectionately called the shock and awe package. It was a masterwork of bureaucratic warfare. At its heart was the 60-page biological survey, complete with the stunning revelations about the eastern prairie-fringed orchid and the ornate chorus frog. But that was just the beginning. I attached high-resolution, glossy photographs of the protected species, each one professionally labeled. I included copies of the relevant sections of the Federal Endangered Species Act of 1973 and the corresponding State Environmental Protection Act, with the paragraphs on habitat destruction and the severe civil and criminal penalties highlighted in bright yellow. Then came the history of the conflict. I included every single letter, notice, and fine I had received from Karen in the HOA board. Following each of her demands was my calm, rational response, creating a clear narrative of a homeowner attempting to cooperate and educate, and an HOA president refusing to listen. It painted a picture of obsessive, targeted harassment. George drafted the cover letter. It was a masterpiece of barely concealed legal threat, written in the dry, precise language of a seasoned attorney. It was addressed not just to Karen, but to every single member of the HOA board of directors, by name at their home addresses. The letter formally notified them that the property at 1212 Meadowlark Court was a verified and documented critical habitat for state and federally protected species. It stated that the HOA's repeated demands to mow, clear, and landscape the property constituted a direct solicitation to commit a criminal act under both state and federal law. It went on to state that any further fines, threats, or attempts to enforce the aesthetic covenants in a way that would harm the habitat would be met with immediate legal action. George included a particularly brilliant clause, informing the board members that their directors' and officers' liability insurance would almost certainly not cover them for willful and intentional criminal acts, meaning they could be held personally and financially liable for the astronomical fines associated with violating the Endangered Species Act. He concluded by formally requesting that all outstanding fines be rescinded and a written apology be issued within 10 business days. We made 7 identical packages, one for Karen, one for each of the other 5 board members, and one for the HOA's management company. On a Tuesday morning, I drove to the main post office and sent all 7 packages via certified mail with return receipt requested. The little green cards would be my proof that they had received their warning. Now all we could do was wait for the shockwaves. The fallout was almost immediate. The certified letters arrived on a Thursday. I imagined Karen ripping hers open, her face contorting with rage as she saw my name, expecting another appeal. I can picture her eyes scanning the legal jargon, the rage turning to confusion, then to a dawning, horrified understanding as she got to the part about the federal crimes and personal liability. The first sign of panic came that evening. I received an email from one of the board members, a quiet accountant named David Chen. It was a frantic, one-sentence message. "Mr. Callahan, we need to talk. Please call me ASAP." I forwarded it to George, who advised me not to respond directly. "Let them sweat," he said. "Let the poison work its way through their system. They need to turn on her first." The next day, Friday, was even better, as Sarah Jenkins called me, her voice buzzing with excitement. "You're not going to believe this," she said. "Karen's been going door to door to the other board members' houses all morning. I saw her at David Chen's house, and they were shouting at each other on his front porch. He was waving a stack of papers at her. It had to be your package." The image was delicious. Karen, the neighborhood terror, being screamed at by her own formerly docile board member. Her authority was cracking. The fear she had so expertly wielded against others was now being turned back on her. But I had underestimated Karen's ego. I thought the threat of federal prosecution would force a strategic retreat. Instead, she did the one thing that would guarantee her own destruction. She doubled down. That evening, a notice was posted on the community bulletin board and emailed to every resident. Emergency HOA meeting? The headline screamed in a 72-point blood-red font. Topic: addressing willful and disruptive non-compliance with community covenants. The notice announced a special meeting for the following Tuesday night at the community clubhouse. It vaguely referenced a dispute with a homeowner who was refusing to maintain their property and was using misleading legal threats to intimidate the board. She was trying to frame me as the villain, a litigious troublemaker trying to tear the community apart. She was going to put me on trial in the court of public opinion. She was turning the conflict into a public spectacle, hoping to shame me into submission. George called me the moment he saw the notice. He was laughing. "She's doing our work for us, Mark," he roared. "She's creating a public record of her own recklessness. She's gathering all the witnesses we need into one room." The stage was set for a final confrontation. Karen thought she was setting a trap for me. In reality, she was marching her entire board, with herself at the head of the column, straight into the kill zone I had so carefully prepared. The emergency meeting was not going to be my trial. It was going to be her tribunal. The night of the emergency meeting, the air in the Oak Creek Meadows clubhouse was thick with tension and the smell of stale coffee. The room, usually reserved for potlucks and children's birthday parties, was packed. Nearly every homeowner was there, drawn by the promise of drama in Karen's inflammatory email. They sat in neat rows of folding chairs, whispering amongst themselves, their faces a mixture of curiosity, annoyance, and for a few fear. I arrived with my own small platoon. George Peterson, in a crisp suit that screamed lawyer, walked beside me carrying a heavy briefcase. Sarah Jenkins, no longer looking anxious but resolute, followed with a folder of her own, containing the stories she had collected from other harassed neighbors. We took seats in the front row, a deliberate move. We were not hiding in the back. We were here to face the music and to conduct the orchestra. The HOA board sat at a long table at the front of the room, facing the audience. Karen was in the center, a large, imposing figure in a power-red blazer. She radiated a furious energy, her eyes scanning the crowd and repeatedly landing on me with undisguised venom. The other board members fidgeted, looking deeply uncomfortable. David Chen, the accountant, refused to make eye contact with anyone, staring intently at his notepad. He looked like a man on his way to the gallows. Karen banged a gavel on the table, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent room. "This emergency meeting of the Oak Creek Meadows Homeowners Association is now in session," she announced, her voice booming. "We are here to discuss a serious and unprecedented challenge to the integrity of our community." She launched into her speech, a masterfully manipulative tirade. She never used my name, referring to me only as one homeowner who believed he was above the rules that bind the rest of us. She painted a picture of a defiant scofflaw who was deliberately cultivating a dangerous and unsightly jungle that was attracting vermin and lowering our property values. She clicked a remote, and a picture flashed onto the projector screen behind her. It was a photo of my property taken from the street, showing the tall grasses and wildflowers. "This," she said with a dramatic sweep of her arm, "is what this homeowner believes is acceptable. This is the eyesore he is fighting to preserve." The crowd murmured. Some people nodded in agreement, conditioned by years of HOA dogma to see anything other than a manicured lawn as a threat. Then Karen made her fatal error. She went from attacking my property to attacking my character. "This homeowner has responded to our community's reasonable requests for maintenance, not with cooperation, but with baseless and frankly insane legal threats. He has sent threatening packages to the board members, full of government nonsense and fake science, in an attempt to intimidate us into letting him turn our beautiful neighborhood into a swamp." She held up a copy of my certified letter packet. "He claims his yard is a special habitat. Well, I have a word for it. It's a dump, and he is demanding that we, the board, bow down to his ridiculous demands. Therefore, I am proposing a motion tonight. I move that the board levy a special punitive fine of $10,000 against this property and immediately authorize our attorneys to place a lien and begin foreclosure proceedings to force compliance. We must send a message that this kind of behavior will not be tolerated. She looked to the rest of the board. I need a second for my motion. The room was dead silent. The other board members looked at her, then at the floor, then at their hands. No one spoke. David Chen looked physically ill. The silence stretched on, thick and uncomfortable. Well, Karen snapped, her composure cracking. David! Maria! Second the motion! Finally, David Chen cleared his throat. Karen, he said, his voice trembling slightly, before we can vote on that, I believe the homeowner should be given a chance to speak. Karen's face turned a shade of purple I had only ever seen in a sunset over a polluted city. But the crowd was murmuring in agreement. She was trapped by the very rules of order she claimed to cherish. Fine, she spat, gesturing dismissively at me. The homeowner has 5 minutes. I stood up and walked to the small lectern at the side of the room. I didn't look at Karen. I looked at the faces in the crowd, my neighbors. I looked at the terrified board members. Good evening, I began, my voice calm and even. My name is Mark Callahan, and I am the homeowner. I'm not going to use my 5 minutes to make a speech. Instead, I just want to provide you all with the information that the board has had for a week. George and Sarah stood up and began moving down the aisles, handing a thin folder to every person in the room. Inside was not the full 60-page report, but a simple 2-page summary. A cover letter explaining the situation in plain English, a list of the protected species on my property, and a printout of the state and federal statutes, with the penalties for habitat destruction clearly highlighted. As people began to read, a wave of whispers turned into a low roar. I saw jaws drop. I saw people looking from the paper in their hands to Karen with dawning horror. I let the information sink in for a full minute before I spoke again. Mrs. Miller is asking the board to force me to commit a federal crime, I said, my voice cutting through the noise. The fine for knowingly destroying the habitat of a federally threatened species like the eastern prairie fringe orchid, which is growing on my land, can be up to $50,000 and include a year in federal prison. That's per violation, per plant. The motion she just proposed is not a request for lawn maintenance. It is a motion for the board to engage in a criminal conspiracy, and as my letter to the board pointed out, their insurance will not cover them. They will be personally liable. I then turned to George. George, could you briefly clarify the legal position of the board members if they vote yes on this motion? George stood up, his tall frame commanding attention. Certainly, he said, his JAG officer voice filling the room. Any board member who votes in favor of Mrs. Miller's motion could be named as a co-conspirator in a federal lawsuit filed by Mr. Callahan and potentially in a criminal complaint filed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We are talking about personal assets, your homes, your retirement savings, all to enforce a rule about grass height against a legally protected nature preserve. A woman in the back of the room gasped. David Chen buried his face in his hands. The entire mood of the room had shifted. The anger was no longer directed at me. It was a tidal wave of fear and fury, and it was crashing directly onto Karen Miller. She was no longer a powerful president. She was a reckless captain who had steered their ship directly onto the rocks. The immediate aftermath of George's pronouncement was chaos. The carefully constructed facade of Karen's authority shattered in an instant. Board member Maria Garcia, a woman who had always been Karen's staunchest supporter, threw her pen down on the table with a loud clatter. I resign, she declared, her voice shaking with rage. I am not going to lose my house because you have a personal vendetta, Karen. This is insane. David Chen looked up, his face pale but his eyes burning. I move to indefinitely table Karen's motion, he said, his voice gaining strength. In fact, I move to formally rescind every fine ever levied against Mr. Callahan's property. Another board member, a young man named Tom, immediately shouted, Second! You can't do that, Karen shrieked, her face a mask of disbelief. She was losing control and she knew it. I am the president. This is my meeting. George stepped forward again. Actually, Mrs. Miller, he said calmly, according to Article 7, Section C of your own bylaws, any board member can propose a motion to table a discussion, and any motion to rescind a previous action is in order if seconded. The board must now vote on Mr. Chen's motion. Karen looked wildly at her collapsing board, her eyes pleading. Vote! David Chen demanded. The vote was swift and brutal. 4-1, with Karen being the lone dissenter, the board voted to both table her insane proposal and rescind all my fines. It was a complete and total repudiation of her leadership. Done publicly, in front of the entire community she had ruled with an iron fist. The room erupted. People were on their feet, many of them now shouting at Karen, airing years of pent-up grievances. What about the fine you gave me for my Christmas lights? An elderly man yelled. You made my wife cry. You threatened to have my dog taken away because he barked at your golf cart, another woman screamed. Sarah Jenkins stood up, her voice clear and strong. She threatened to call Child Protective Services on me because my children drew on our own driveway with chalk. A wave of disgust rippled through the crowd. Karen, who had entered the room as a queen, was now cornered, exposed as a petty, cruel bully. She grabbed her gavel and banged it uselessly against the table, screaming for order, but no one was listening. Her power was an illusion, and the spell had been broken. She finally threw the gavel down, gathered her papers with trembling hands, and stormed out of the clubhouse, pushing through the crowd of angry homeowners. The door slammed shut behind her, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. In the days that followed, the dam of fear completely broke. My phone and email were flooded with messages from neighbors. People I had only ever nodded to were stopping me in the street to shake my hand and share their own horror stories about Karen. George and I became the de facto leaders of a revolution. We helped residents draft formal complaints based on the evidence they had. Sarah's folder of stories grew thick. We had documented proof of financial mismanagement, selective enforcement, harassment, and abuse of power. We compiled this new evidence into another package. This one wasn't for the HOA. I sent one copy to the State Attorney General's office, filing a formal complaint against the Oak Creek Meadows HOA for unlawful practices. I sent another copy to the HOA's insurance carrier, politely notifying them of the board's near-catastrophic brush with federal law and the ongoing pattern of misconduct, which put them at massive financial risk. The response from the insurance company was swift and decisive. They sent a letter to the remaining board members informing them that their directors' and officers' liability policy was under review and would likely be canceled unless significant and immediate changes to leadership and procedure were implemented. They were essentially being told, get rid of Karen or you're on your own. The board, now terrified of being uninsured and facing a state investigation, acted quickly. David Chen, showing a spine I never knew he had, spearheaded a formal recall petition against Karen. It required signatures from 25% of the homeowners. They got over 70% in 3 days. A final emergency meeting was called. Karen didn't even show up. The vote to recall her as president and remove her from the board was unanimous. David Chen was elected as the new interim president on a platform of transparency, fairness, and a complete review of all existing covenants. The first official act of the new board was to draft a formal, written apology to me, which they published in the community newsletter. They acknowledged the ecological significance of my property and announced they were working with legal counsel to amend the bylaws to include provisions for certified natural habitats. My personal battle was over, but the war for the soul of the community was won. The fear that had permeated Oak Creek Meadows was gone, replaced by a sense of empowerment and unity. People started talking to each other again, not in whispers, but as neighbors. The oppressive, sterile conformity Karen had tried to enforce began to crack. A few more unapproved flower colors appeared. A rogue garden gnome popped up. It was a small, quiet rebellion, but it was beautiful. My victory wasn't just in the rescinded fines or the public apology. It was in the silence that followed. The silence of no more threatening letters in my mailbox. The silence of Karen's golf cart no longer prowling the streets. It was the return of the peaceful quiet I had moved here to find. A quiet now filled only with the rustle of the prairie grass and the chirping of the frogs she had so desperately wanted me to destroy. The weeks after Karen's ousting felt like the calm after a long and brutal storm. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the neighborhood lifted, replaced by a tentative but growing sense of community. The new HOA board, led by a surprisingly effective David Chen, began the painstaking process of untangling the web of absurd rules and vindictive policies Karen had created. They held open town halls, and for the first time, they actually listened. George Peterson was asked to lead a committee to rewrite the covenants, transforming them from a weapon of control into a simple framework for shared living. My property, once the source of so much conflict, became something of a local landmark. People I'd never spoken to before would stop by, not to complain, but to ask questions. I started giving informal tours on Saturday mornings. I'd walk groups of my neighbors through the tall grasses, pointing out the compass plants whose leaves align north to south, showing them the delicate, almost hidden prairie orchids, and explaining how the deep roots of the bluestem were healing the soil. Sarah Jenkins started bringing her kids over regularly. They had a natural, uninhibited curiosity that was a joy to watch. They learned the names of the different wildflowers and would get excited when they spotted a monarch butterfly caterpillar on a milkweed leaf. Their fear of being outside, of accidentally breaking some invisible rule, was gone. They were free to just be kids, and my weed patch was their new favorite playground. One afternoon, as I was showing Sarah's son how to find tree frogs camouflaged on the bark of a cottonwood, a sleek black sedan I didn't recognize pulled up to my driveway. A woman in a sharp business suit got out, looking a bit out of place against the wild backdrop of the prairie. She introduced herself as an investigator from the state attorney general's office. She had my original complaint in her hand. We spoke for over an hour. I walked her through the entire saga, from the first letter to the climactic HOA meeting. I provided her with the names of George, Sarah, and a dozen other residents who had suffered under Karen's reign. The state's investigation was expanding beyond my personal case. They were conducting a full audit of the HOA's finances and reviewing years of board meeting minutes and violation records. They had uncovered evidence that Karen had been using HOA funds to pay for legal consultations related to her personal vendettas, and had waived fines for her friends while ruthlessly pursuing others. The legal net was closing around her, not just for her actions against me, but for a systemic abuse of her position. The symbolic final confrontation came a month later, not in a tense meeting, but in the quiet of a Tuesday afternoon. I saw a moving truck parked in front of Karen's house. Her reign of terror had ended not with a bang, but with the pathetic sight of cardboard boxes and rolled-up rugs being loaded into a truck. She was leaving, forced out not by a direct order, but by the complete social and political isolation she had brought upon herself. No one threw her a going-away party. No one stopped to wish her well. Her neighbors simply watched, silent and unmoved, as the last vestiges of her petty tyranny were hauled away. She saw me standing in my yard as her car pulled out of her driveway for the last time. Our eyes met for a brief second across the street. There was no anger in her face anymore, just a hollow, defeated emptiness. She had built her identity on a foundation of power and control, and when that was stripped away, there was nothing left. She looked away first and drove down the street, out of Oak Creek Meadows and out of our lives forever. The real victory, the one that mattered most to me, came in the form of an official-looking envelope from the State Department of Natural Resources, my own employer. It wasn't a disciplinary letter or a legal notice. It was a letter of commendation. The story of my little suburban habitat had made its way up the chain of command. The state's top biologists had reviewed the survey conducted by Dr. Thorne and Lena Petrova. They were officially designating my 3 acres as a state-protected scientific and natural area. But the letter contained something more. In light of the unique community engagement and the educational potential of a remnant prairie in a residential setting, the department was awarding me a small conservation grant. It wasn't a lot of money, but it was enough to install a proper walking path, put up educational plaques identifying the various plant species, and create a small observation deck overlooking the wetland portion of the property. My private sanctuary was going to become a community asset, a place where children and adults could come to connect with the natural world that Karen had tried so hard to pave over. The restoration of the land and the restoration of the community had become one and the same. It was a testament to the idea that one person, standing their ground with quiet persistence and irrefutable facts, could make a profound difference. The following spring was a season of rebirth in more ways than one. Armed with a state grant and a small army of neighborhood volunteers, we transformed the prairie. We didn't tame it, but we made it accessible. George Peterson, a surprisingly skilled woodworker, helped me design and build a simple boardwalk that snaked through the wettest parts of the sedge meadow, allowing people to get close to the heart of the ecosystem without disturbing the fragile soil. Sarah Jenkins, who had a hidden talent for graphic design, created beautiful, professional-looking educational plaques. Each one featured a photo of a native plant or animal, its common and scientific names, and a short description of its role in the prairie. We installed them along the new gravel walking path that wound through the tall grasses. The project became a weekend gathering spot. People who had barely spoken to each other a year ago were now working side by side, hauling gravel, digging post holes, and sharing thermoses of coffee. The work was hard, but the mood was light and joyful. The shared goal of building something positive, of healing both the land and their own fractured community, was a powerful tonic. The kids were the most enthusiastic volunteers, their small hands eagerly spreading wildflower seeds or helping to paint the wooden railings of the observation deck. They were learning to be stewards of the land, a lesson far more valuable than anything Karen's rulebook could have taught them. The grand opening of the Oak Creek Prairie Path, as we decided to call it, was a neighborhood-wide event. We had a simple ribbon-cutting ceremony. David Chen, the new HOA president, gave a short, heartfelt speech about second chances and the importance of listening to one's neighbors. He publicly thanked me, not for fighting the HOA, but for showing them a better way forward. I said a few words myself, talking not about the conflict, but about the resilience of nature and the power of a community to come together. I dedicated the path to all the residents of Oak Creek Meadows. The real guest of honor, however, made his appearance after the sun had set. As dust settled over the prairie, a profound quiet fell over the crowd gathered on the observation deck. And then it began, a single high-pitched peep, followed by another and another, until the air was filled with a chorus of hundreds of tiny voices. It was the sound of the ornate chorus frogs, the endangered species that had been the legal linchpin of my entire fight. Most of the residents had never heard them before. They were a secret, hidden symphony that had been playing in their backyards all along. Listening to their song, surrounded by my neighbors, I felt a sense of peace that was deeper and more profound than the simple quiet I had originally sought. This was better than solitude. This was connection. This was home. The story didn't completely end there. The Attorney General's investigation concluded 6 months later. Karen Miller was charged with several counts of misdemeanor official misconduct and embezzlement of HOA funds. She pleaded no contest, was forced to pay a hefty fine and restitution to the HOA, and was sentenced to 200 hours of community service. In a moment of what I can only describe as cosmic irony, a judge with a sense of humor assigned her to a crew that removed invasive buckthorn from state parklands. The woman who hated weeds was now legally obligated to spend her weekends pulling them. George found this particularly satisfying. He kept a framed copy of the local news article about her sentencing on his mantelpiece. As for the prairie, it continued to thrive. The next year, Lena Petrova, the botanist, discovered 2 more species of rare wildflowers we had missed on the initial survey. The bird population exploded, with migratory warblers and indigo buntings, making the prairie a regular stop on their long journeys. It became a living, breathing testament to the idea that sometimes the most valuable thing you can do is to just let things be. My life settled into a new, happy rhythm. My work with the Fish and Wildlife Department felt more meaningful than ever, and my home was no longer a fortress, but a sanctuary I could share. I had fought a war not with weapons, but with knowledge, patience, and the law. I had faced down a petty tyrant, and in doing so, helped my neighbors reclaim their own sense of agency. The victory was sweet, not because I had defeated Karen, but because we had collectively replaced her legacy of fear and division with one of cooperation and respect. Every evening, I still walk the path through my little prairie. I listen to the wind in the blue stem. I watch the fireflies rise from the grass like scattered embers, and I hear the hopeful, defiant chorus of the frogs. They are a constant reminder that even in the most manicured of worlds, wildness endures. And sometimes, if you're willing to fight for it, it can not only survive, but flourish, bringing an entire community back to life along with it.